March 15, 2024, a federal judge walked into his own restaurant one ordinary afternoon and witnessed something that made his blood run cold. His own staff turned away a disabled customer at the door, claiming he was a liability. What happened next didn't just change one man's life. It sparked a national conversation that forced Americans to ask themselves an uncomfortable question. If the law says everyone deserves access, why do we still find reasons to say no? The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Wellington's table, casting long shadows across the mahogany bar. Judge Marcus Wellington stood in the center of his restaurant, coffee mug in hand, surveying the space with the same careful attention he brought to the courtroom. Everything was in order. Everything always was. At 58, Marcus had built a life that looked exactly like success. The restaurant occupied a prestigious corner on Merchant Street in Portland, Oregon, a location he'd fought city zoning boards to secure 15 years ago. The dining room gleamed with reclaimed wood tables, Edison bulbs hung from the ceiling, and the wine collection behind the glass displayed over 300 selections. More importantly, it was his domain, a place where he controlled every variable, every outcome, every detail. The staff knew their choreography by heart. Marcus had trained them personally. Hosts greeted guests within 90 seconds of arrival. Waiters anticipated needs before they were voiced. The kitchen operated with military precision. Complaints were rare. Returns were rarer. The restaurant had received 2 Michelin stars, featured in Portland Monthly's top 10 establishments, and maintained a waiting list that extended 3 months out. Critics called it immaculate. Marcus called it home. But home, like empires, requires constant maintenance. Marcus arrived each morning at 5:47 a.m., never 5:45, never 5:50. He believed in precision the way most people believe in gravity, as an unquestionable law. He reviewed the reservation book, checked inventory reports, and read through staff notes from the previous night's service. He adjusted. He controlled. He commanded. It was what judges did. It was what successful men did. It was what Marcus Wellington had always done. His daughter, Emily, worked as a hostess 3 nights a week. She was 22, studying hospitality management at Portland State, and Marcus was grooming her to eventually take over the business. He'd already mapped out her trajectory. Hostess, server, assistant manager, general manager, owner-operator. The path was clear. The destination was predetermined. Emily would inherit not just a restaurant, but a legacy of excellence. His ex-wife, Patricia, used to joke that Marcus loved his restaurant more than he loved people. She'd said it bitterly during the divorce proceedings 12 years ago. At the time, he'd dismissed it as unfair. Looking back now, he wasn't sure. What he knew was that his restaurant had never disappointed him the way people had. It had never questioned his methods or challenged his authority. It simply delivered results. The restaurant was also his refuge. After long days in federal court, hearing cases about discrimination, accessibility violations, civil rights disputes, Marcus would retreat to Wellington's table and lose himself in the mechanics of hospitality. He'd rewrite menu descriptions. He'd reorganize the wine list. He'd observe servers and make mental notes about posture and pacing. Here, in this space, everything made sense. Here, justice was clean and logical. Good service, fair pricing, satisfied customers. No ambiguity. No suffering that couldn't be solved with a better reservation system or faster table turnover. Marcus had never thought of himself as insensitive. He donated to charities. He volunteered with the Legal Aid Society. He wrote checks to organizations that helped people in crisis. But there was a distance to his charity, a professional detachment. He helped people by ruling in their favor, by interpreting law, by wielding his authority from the bench. He helped people the way a surgeon helps people, with precision, from a safe remove, with clear boundaries between his suffering and theirs. What he didn't do was sit with people in their struggle. What he didn't do was allow ambiguity or inconvenience into his carefully constructed world. What he didn't do was ask himself why his restaurant had never hosted a support group for people with disabilities, or why he'd never questioned whether his space was truly accessible to everyone, or why he'd built an empire so perfect that it had no room for imperfection, or people who didn't fit the mold. The restaurant was a monument to his vision. And monuments, by definition, are not designed for everyone. On the morning of March 15, 2024, Marcus conducted his routine inspection. He walked the dining room with a notepad, checking sight lines, testing light switches, ensuring place settings were equidistant from table edges. He inspected the restrooms, adjusted soap dispensers, verified that the wheelchair-accessible stall was clear. He'd installed it years ago, after a lawsuit he'd adjudicated involving an inaccessible hotel chain. He'd been thorough about the requirement, a model of compliance. But like many rules that are technically followed, it was followed without conviction. It was a box checked, not a principle embraced. By 11:45 a.m., the restaurant was nearly full for lunch service. The kitchen hummed. The servers moved like dancers. The noise level was perfect, loud enough to feel vibrant, quiet enough to allow conversation. Every table was occupied by people who fit the aesthetic. Professionals in business casual. Couples celebrating anniversaries. Groups of friends who laughed loudly and ordered expensive wines. Marcus stood behind the bar, reviewing tomorrow's reservations and feeling, as he always did at this moment, a deep sense of satisfaction. Everything was working. Everything was controlled. Everything was exactly as it should be. He had no idea that in 47 minutes that world would crack. He had no idea that the illusion of control was about to shatter, and that the man who had spent 2 decades refusing to look at the people left outside his empire was about to be forced to see them. Not as abstractions or court cases or charitable obligations, but as human beings whose very presence would challenge every assumption he'd made about justice, accessibility, and what it really meant to run an ethical business. Marcus Wellington was about to learn that some violations of law aren't visible from inside the frame you've built, and that seeing them, once you finally do, changes everything. David Chun had been looking forward to lunch at Wellington's table for 3 weeks. His physical therapist, Rebecca, had recommended it during one of their sessions. "Best salmon in Portland," she'd said. "My husband proposed there. You'll love it." David had made the reservation himself, calling the restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon and speaking with a cheerful hostess named Emily who confirmed his party for 12:15 p.m. on Friday. He'd been paralyzed from the waist down for 4 years. A spinal cord injury from a motorcycle accident that had forced him to rebuild everything. His career as a graphic designer, his independence, his sense of possibility. The therapist sessions were part of that rebuilding. So was this lunch. It was small, but it mattered. Eating at a nice restaurant alone, without self-consciousness, felt like proof that his life hadn't ended. It had only changed. That morning, David transferred himself into his wheelchair with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He showered, dressed carefully in dark jeans and a button-up shirt, and applied cologne. Small rituals of normalcy that people who could walk took for granted. He wheeled himself to his van, used the hydraulic lift to raise his wheelchair onto the platform, secured the locks, and drove across Portland to Merchant Street with the radio playing softly. The restaurant's exterior was beautiful, large windows, a tasteful awning, the kind of place that looked like it had been on this corner since before he was born. David pulled into the accessible parking space directly in front, grateful that whoever designed the lot had at least considered that detail. He lowered the hydraulic platform, wheeled himself out, and approached the entrance. That's where everything changed. The front door was heavy. David had learned to recognize this particular architecture of exclusion years ago. Heavy doors that required someone to push from the side. No automatic opener. He maneuvered himself to angle his shoulders and push, but the door barely budged. He tried again, harder, and managed to crack it open just wide enough to see inside. The hostess stand was visible. He could see a young woman, Emily probably, and another staff member behind her. David called out, "Hi, I have a reservation at 12:15. Emily looked up, saw him, and her expression flickered. Not hostile. Not yet. Just calculating. She said something to the other staff member, who disappeared into the back. Emily approached the door but didn't open it further. "Hi," she said through the gap. "I'm so sorry, but we're actually not able to accommodate you right now." David's stomach tightened. "I have a reservation. Under Chen?" Party of one. I know, and I apologize, Emily said, and she did sound apologetic, which somehow made it worse. But we're just really busy today, and honestly, our space isn't set up for. It's just not ideal for wheelchairs. The aisles are narrow, and we don't want you to feel uncomfortable. The lie was so smooth it almost worked. David had heard variations of it before, and he recognized it for what it was, a polite way of saying, you don't fit our aesthetic. You'll make the other guests uncomfortable. We've decided you're a problem. The ADA requires, David started, but Emily cut him off gently. I completely understand, and I'm really sorry. We just can't serve you today. If you'd like to reschedule for a quieter time, we'd be happy to accommodate you then. The door closed. David sat in his wheelchair, staring at the mahogany and glass. His hands were shaking, not from anger yet, from the particular cold shock of rejection that he'd learned to brace for, but never quite expected. The irrational part of his brain that still believed people were basically good had taken a hit. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the entrance. He rolled backward, away from the door, and sat on the sidewalk for a moment, trying to decide whether to leave or call someone. He called Rebecca. They turned me away, he said when she picked up. Said the space wasn't suitable for wheelchairs. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Wellington's Table? Yeah. That's a federal judge's restaurant, she said slowly. Judge Marcus Wellington. He owns it. And he's turned you away. David hadn't known that. It didn't change anything, but somehow it made it worse. A federal judge, someone whose entire job was interpreting and enforcing civil rights law, was running a business that violated the very law he upheld from the bench. Inside Wellington's Table, 20 minutes later, Judge Marcus Wellington was reviewing the afternoon's reservations when Emily approached him in the kitchen. She looked upset. Dad, something happened, she said. Marcus looked up from the reservation book. What is it? A customer came in. He was in a wheelchair. He had a reservation. I saw it in the system, 12:15. His name was Chun. But he couldn't open the front door, and the aisles are really tight, and I told him we couldn't accommodate him today. Marcus barely looked up. Was he aggressive? No, he was actually really polite. But I just thought. Then you did the right thing, Marcus said, returning his attention to the book. We can't risk an accident. Liability issues. If someone in a wheelchair got stuck in the aisle or had some kind of incident, we'd be the ones held responsible. Better to redirect him than create a problem. Emily hesitated. She was 22 and still learning to trust her instincts. Her father was a federal judge. Surely he knew something about law that she didn't, but something in his response felt wrong to her. Perfunctory, like he hadn't really heard what she said. Was that legal? She asked quietly. Marcus set down his pen and finally looked at his daughter with mild irritation. The ADA has reasonable accommodation requirements, not absolute requirements. We can't fundamentally alter our business model. If we'd have to rebuild the entire restaurant to accommodate one customer, that's not reasonable. So yes, what you did was fine. He was confident when he said it. Authoritative. But what he didn't do was check the law. What he didn't do was pull up the actual ADA guidelines. What he didn't do was ask himself whether a customer being turned away because of disability constituted a fundamental alteration, or just an inconvenience he decided to avoid. What he didn't do was wonder whether his daughter's discomfort might be telling him something important. Instead, he returned to his reservation book, and Emily walked away uncertain. And David Chun sat in his van on Merchant Street, wondering why a judge's restaurant had just violated his rights so smoothly, so politely, so completely. That night, David couldn't stop thinking about it. He wasn't angry yet. He was confused. The person at the door had seemed genuinely sorry. The excuse had been technically plausible. But it was also bullshit, and he knew it. Restaurants managed narrow aisles all the time. People in wheelchairs navigated narrow spaces all the time. The problem wasn't the space. The problem was that he'd been deemed an inconvenience, and someone had decided that his right to eat at a restaurant was less important than the restaurant's comfort level. He texted his brother, Stephen, who worked in media. He sent him the photo of the entrance and a brief summary of what happened. Stephen texted back, "That's Judge Wellington's place. You should report this. This is literally illegal." David had filed complaints before. They rarely went anywhere. But he filed one anyway, a formal ADA complaint with the Department of Justice. He didn't expect anything to come from it. What he didn't know was that Judge Marcus Wellington's blind spot was about to become very, very visible, and that the universe had a particular sense of irony about where it would crack first. It would crack in the most public way possible. It would crack at a moment when Marcus couldn't hide from it, and it would force him to confront the question he'd spent his entire life avoiding. What does justice look like when you're the one violating it? 2 weeks after David's complaint was filed, a legal blogger named Sarah Morrison, who monitored ADA violations and civil rights cases, stumbled across the Department of Justice complaint. She recognized the name immediately. Judge Marcus Wellington, federal judge, restaurant owner, man who'd ruled on 3 major accessibility cases in the past 5 years. She dug deeper. She contacted David, who agreed to an interview. She researched Wellington's table's accessibility record. She reviewed the ADA guidelines. And then she wrote a piece titled, "Federal Judge Rules on Disability Rights by Day, Violates Them by Night, The Wellington's Table Story." The article went live on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it had been shared 47,000 times. By Thursday, local news outlets picked it up. By Friday, national outlets followed. The headline was irresistible. Irony or hypocrisy? Judge who enforces disability law accused of violating it. Cable news loved it. Twitter exploded. Reddit threads multiplied. Within 72 hours, Judge Marcus Wellington's carefully constructed reputation had become a referendum on institutional hypocrisy. Marcus first learned about it from his law clerk, who nervously approached him in chambers with a printout of the article. He read it standing up, his face growing darker with each sentence. The blogger had quoted him, or rather, quoted his daughter quoting him, justifying the denial of service with legal reasoning that the blogger had systematically dismantled. His phone began ringing immediately. The court administrator, the bar association. His ex-wife, Patricia, called to ask if he'd lost his mind. Media outlets requesting comment. Other judges, some sympathetic, some pointedly silent. That evening, Marcus sat in his office at the restaurant. The place was closed. He was alone. He pulled up the article on his computer and read it again, then a third time. Every word was accurate. Every quote was real. Every criticism was justified. He had a choice. He could fight. He could claim the blogger had misrepresented the situation. He could argue that David Chen's complaint was frivolous, that the restaurant genuinely couldn't accommodate wheelchairs without fundamental alteration, that he'd acted within the law. His lawyer had already called, offering to defend him, suggesting a statement about taken out of context and malicious misrepresentation. Or he could stop. He could acknowledge what had happened. He could admit that he'd been wrong, not just legally but morally. He could close the restaurant if necessary. He could apologize publicly. He could become the opposite of what he'd been defending. A man willing to admit error and change course, even when it cost him. The choice seemed simple in theory. In practice, it meant dismantling the narrative he'd built about himself. It meant admitting that all those years of ruling on disability cases from the bench hadn't actually taught him empathy. They just taught him legal language. It meant confessing that his restaurant's perfection was built on exclusion. It meant stepping down from the role of judge and authority and becoming simply a man who'd been caught doing harm. Marcus stared at his phone. His lawyer was waiting for his call. The media was waiting for his statement. His daughter was waiting for his direction. He thought about David Chen, paralyzed from the waist down, turned away at the door of a restaurant run by a man whose entire career was supposedly about justice. And then Judge Marcus Wellington made the choice that would change everything. Judge Marcus Wellington issued a public apology on a Saturday morning. It was not crafted by lawyers or publicists. It was written in his own hand, recorded in a single take, no editing, no retakes. He sat at his desk in the restaurant, the same desk where he'd dismissed his daughter's concerns, and he spoke. "I violated the law I've spent my career enforcing," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I violated the rights of a customer based on his disability. I justified it with twisted legal reasoning that I now recognize as cowardice dressed up in legal language. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. I'm announcing the immediate closure of Wellington's Table, effective immediately. The restaurant will undergo a complete accessibility audit and renovation. If we can meet full ADA compliance, we will reopen. If we cannot, the space will be repurposed or sold. I'm also stepping down from the bench, effective 30 days from now." The apology went viral instantly, but the response was not what Marcus expected. The hate mail arrived within hours. Emails calling him a coward for abandoning his position. Social media posts accusing him of virtue signaling, of destroying a business to cover up his guilt, of using David Chen's story for his own redemption narrative. Online forums debated whether his apology was genuine or manipulative. Some people defended him. Many more attacked him from all sides. Progressives saying it wasn't enough. Conservatives saying he betrayed his colleagues on the bench. His legal colleagues were silent, then cold. Judges he'd worked with for 20 years suddenly didn't return calls. Bar associations launched inquiries. Other restaurant owners in Portland distanced themselves, worried about guilt by association. One morning, the restaurant windows were spray-painted with messages, "Performative justice" and "Fake apology." His daughter Emily, who'd turned away David Chun, stopped coming to family dinners. She felt implicated, blamed, and ashamed. She changed her major from hospitality management to sociology. Not a rebellion, but a reckoning. She didn't speak to her father for 6 weeks. The investigation deepened. Journalists discovered that Wellington's Table hadn't been the only violation. They found documented complaints from years past. A deaf customer who'd requested an interpreter and been told it wasn't feasible. A woman with anxiety disorder who'd called ahead and been denied a reservation based on her disability disclosure. Marcus had never known about these incidents. They'd been handled by his staff. But they were his responsibility. They were his pattern. Each discovery felt like another failure. Marcus attended a meeting with David Chun, facilitated by a mediator. It was awkward and painful. David didn't need Marcus's apology. He needed the law to work. He needed systemic change, not personal redemption. Marcus realized that his private remorse meant nothing to David. What mattered was action, accountability, change that extended beyond Marcus's own conscience. The closure of Wellington's Table sent shockwaves through Portland's restaurant community. A beloved establishment was gone. Staff members were laid off. Customers mourned the loss of a place they'd loved. And Marcus, who'd built an empire on perfection, was now associated with its dissolution. He considered resigning his apology. He considered fighting back. He considered disappearing. But he didn't. Instead, he sat in the empty restaurant night after night, surrounded by the shell of his former achievement, and forced himself to ask, what does accountability actually look like? Not in words, but in sustained, unglamorous action? That's when the real work began. Marcus didn't wait for redemption to find him. Instead, he started speaking. 3 weeks after closing Wellington's Table, he did something unprecedented. He requested to testify before the Oregon Legislative Committee on Accessibility and Disability Rights. Not as a judge offering expert legal opinion. As a man who just committed an ADA violation and was willing to publicly dissect how it happened. He sat before the committee and didn't perform. He didn't use legal jargon or abstract principles. He told them exactly what he'd done and why, not the lies he told himself, but the actual reasoning. That accommodating David Chun would be inconvenient, that his restaurant's aesthetic mattered more than David's right to enter, that he'd been willing to bend the law because he controlled the space. I spent 20 years interpreting civil rights law from the bench, Marcus said, his voice steady. And in all that time, I never once sat with the actual impact of noncompliance. I never had to face the person I harmed. Until I did. And I realized that all the legal training in the world doesn't matter if you're not willing to see the human being on the other side of your decision. He spoke about his daughter, about how her discomfort had been a signal he'd ignored. He spoke about the other violations at his restaurant that he'd never known about because his systems were designed to shield him from difficult information. He spoke about complicity masquerading as compliance. The testimony was filmed. It went viral in a different way than the scandal had, not as entertainment or outrage, but as something rarer. A person of authority admitting systemic failure and structural blindness. David Chun watched the testimony. He didn't cry. He didn't feel vindicated. But he did feel something shift. Marcus's words weren't about Marcus anymore. They were about accountability. They were useful. More importantly, they opened a door. David reached out to Marcus directly. Not to forgive him, but to collaborate. He wanted to work with Marcus on something bigger than apologies. Something that addressed the systemic failures that had allowed the violation to happen in the first place. Over the next 2 months, Marcus and David created a training program. From the bench to the ground. What judges and business owners need to know about disability access. It wasn't about legal compliance. It was about seeing disabled people as full participants in public life, not problems to be managed. Marcus taught the course himself, often alongside disability advocates who held him accountable when he slipped into academic language or distanced himself from impact. He didn't present himself as reformed. He presented himself as learning. There was a difference. The program was adopted by 3 state court systems and 15 major Portland businesses. Hundreds of judges and business owners took it. And Marcus, stripped of his bench, his restaurant, and his illusions of control, became most useful when he was willing to be vulnerable about his own complicity. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who'd been caught breaking the law and had chosen to keep breaking the silence around it instead. That choice, to speak from the ground rather than from authority, changed the trajectory of everything that followed. 8 months after Marcus closed Wellington's table, the Department of Justice issued its formal finding. The investigation had been thorough. They'd reviewed all the documented incidents, interviewed staff, analyzed the restaurant's accessibility features against ADA standards, and examined Marcus's own legal reasoning for why he'd justified the discrimination. The finding was unambiguous. Wellington's table had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. The violation was not a gray area. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was clear, deliberate noncompliance. But here's where the story took an unexpected turn. Instead of proceeding with a settlement that would have been routine, financial penalties, forced compliance measures, mandatory training, the DOJ contacted Marcus directly. They wanted to do something different. They wanted to use his case as a model. "You've already closed the business and admitted liability," the DOJ attorney, Catherine Hammond, explained during a phone call. "You've already stepped down from the bench and created educational programming. Most defendants fight or settle quietly. You've done the opposite. We want to document how that actually works." What followed was unprecedented. A federal case that wasn't adversarial, but collaborative. The DOJ and Marcus worked together to create a comprehensive public record of what institutional disability discrimination looks like, not in abstract legal terms, but in real operational decisions. They documented every moment where Marcus had chosen convenience over access, where he justified exclusion with twisted legal reasoning, where his systems had been designed to keep difficult information away from him. They also documented what accountability looks like. Not a performative apology, but sustained institutional change. The training program Marcus had created with David Chun was analyzed. The staff retraining protocols were examined. The ways Marcus had restructured his thinking about access were laid bare. The federal judge assigned to the case, Judge Helen Torres, issued a ruling that became a landmark decision. It wasn't just about Wellington's table. It was about how institutions, especially those run by people with power, systematize discrimination without intending to, or rather, without admitting the intention. Judge Wellington's violation of the ADA was not aberrational, Judge Torres wrote. It was structural. It was the logical outcome of a system designed to center comfort over access, aesthetics over rights, and the preferences of the majority over the needs of the minority. What makes this case instructive is not his violation, but his willingness to dismantle the systems that enabled it. The ruling required every restaurant in Oregon with similar capacity to undergo accessibility audits. It required federal courts to implement disability impact assessments before making operational decisions. It created a template for accountability that other institutions could follow. But more importantly, it recognized David Chen by name. It documented his harm. It centered his experience as the injury that had been done, and made clear that Marcus's response, however genuine, was accountability, not redemption. The media coverage was extensive, but it was different from the initial scandal coverage. This time, the story wasn't about a judge's hypocrisy. It was about what happens when someone in power is willing to be held accountable in public systematically without defending themselves. News outlets interviewed disability advocates who said the case had shifted something in how they approached advocacy. Instead of just fighting violations, they could now point to a model of accountability. Law schools began teaching the Wellington case as a study in institutional change. Business schools used it as a case study in ethical leadership. David Chen did a series of interviews. He didn't frame Marcus as a hero. He framed him as someone who'd been caught breaking the law and had chosen not to hide. The system wants us to believe that one person admitting they're wrong fixes the problem, David said in one interview. It doesn't, but it does create space for others to look at their own systems. That's useful. It's not redemption, but it's something. 6 months after the DOJ ruling, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from Emily, his daughter. She'd graduated and was now working for a disability rights organization. The letter was brief. Dad, I'm not writing to say I forgive you. Forgiveness isn't really mine to give. But I wanted you to know that I watched what you did, how you didn't hide, how you kept showing up even when it was uncomfortable. I'm working in this space now because of what happened. Not because I want to fix your reputation, but because I realize that systems need to be changed from the inside, and I want to be part of that. I hope you do too. Emily. Marcus read the letter multiple times. It wasn't an absolution. It was an acknowledgement. It was his daughter telling him that his accountability had mattered, not to him, but to her. She'd watched him sit with discomfort, and she'd decided to walk into discomfort herself. The institutional recognition, the DOJ ruling, the media coverage, the adoption of his training program by other jurisdictions, all of that was significant. But what moved him most was a 15-year-old girl in Portland who'd been denied service at a coffee shop because she used a wheelchair, and whose mother, after reading about the Wellington case, had filed a complaint instead of accepting it. That girl got served at the coffee shop. The business owner, seeing the precedent set by the Wellington case, made immediate changes. One person's accountability had created ripples. Not redemption, but consequence. Not forgiveness, but change that extended beyond Marcus's own conscience into the world. And that, Marcus realized, was what justice actually looked like. Not the absence of violation, but the willingness to transform violation into accountability, and accountability into systemic change. 2 years after David Chen was turned away from Wellington's table, Marcus stood in a completely different restaurant. This one was called Access First, and it was located in a modest corner of southeast Portland. It didn't have Michelin stars or imported wine collections. It had wheelchair-accessible bathrooms with grab bars installed by people who actually knew how to install them. It had a menu in Braille and large print. It had trained staff who understood that accessibility wasn't an accommodation. It was the baseline. But Access First wasn't Marcus's restaurant. It was David's. With funding from settlements and public interest grants, David had opened his own establishment. Not to prove he could run a business better than Marcus, but to build something that would be fundamentally different from the start. Accessible from the ground up, not retrofitted. Inclusive from day one, not added later as an afterthought. Marcus was there as a consultant, not an owner. He'd learned the difference between those roles. The transformation of Marcus's life over the past 2 years had been neither redemptive nor linear. He'd lost his bench, his restaurant, his social standing. He'd gained something less glamorous but more substantial, a clear understanding of what accountability actually requires. He'd started the Disability Access Initiative, a nonprofit organization that worked with businesses to implement genuine accessibility rather than performative compliance. The organization didn't just conduct audits. It hired disabled consultants to work with business owners, showing them what it looked like from the inside when your space excluded people. Marcus had also become a writer. His op-eds in national publications didn't center his own transformation. They centered the disabled people whose lives were affected by systemic exclusion. He wrote about transportation barriers, employment discrimination, healthcare access, all the things he'd never thought about when he was running his perfect restaurant. Most importantly, he'd learned to listen without needing credit. One afternoon, while Marcus was reviewing accessibility plans for a new hotel in Portland, Emily stopped by the office. She now worked full-time for a disability rights nonprofit. She and her father had built a relationship that wasn't based on forgiveness. It was based on shared work. "I wanted to update you on something," Emily said, sitting across from him. "The Legislative Committee is moving forward with a bill that would require all public accommodations to undergo accessibility audits every 2 years. They're using your case as precedent, but they're not calling it the Wellington case. They're calling it the Chun case. They're making sure his name is the one attached to the change." Marcus nodded. He understood why. David had been the one wronged. David had been the one to hold the system accountable. Marcus's role had been to stop defending the system. "That's how it should be," Marcus said. Emily smiled. "I also wanted to tell you, I'm running for city council. I'm going to focus on disability accessibility in public spaces. I know you probably have opinions about my platform." "I do," Marcus said, "but I'm going to listen to your ideas first, and then ask you questions instead of giving you answers." "How's that?" "That," Emily said, "is how you've actually changed." The Access First restaurant opened on a Thursday afternoon. David had invited everyone, disability advocates, journalists, business owners who were trying to do better, and Marcus. There was no ribbon cutting. There was no speech about redemption or second chances. There was just a space that was built from the beginning with the understanding that access is not an add-on. David gave a short talk. He spoke about what it had meant to be turned away. He spoke about the anger, the confusion, the violation. And then he spoke about what had surprised him. That one person's willingness to stop defending their violation had created space for systemic change. "This restaurant exists because Judge Wellington broke the law and refused to hide it," David said. "That doesn't make him a good person. That doesn't erase what he did. But it does mean that his violation became a tool for change. And I wanted to use that tool to build something new." He looked directly at Marcus, who was standing in the back. "He lost his career and his business. I've been thinking a lot about whether that's enough, whether accountability requires that kind of destruction. And I think the answer is, only if that's the only way to shift behavior. In his case, it was, but going forward, maybe institutions can change before they have to be destroyed." Marcus didn't move. He didn't try to receive credit or absolution. He simply listened. After the opening, as the crowd dispersed, David pulled Marcus aside. "I want to start something new," David said. "A foundation for disabled entrepreneurs. Places where people like me can access capital, mentorship, and technical support to build businesses that are accessible from the start. I want you to help with the curriculum, teaching business owners what you've learned about systemic exclusion." "Not as the leader," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Not as the leader," David confirmed. "As someone who's learned what happens when you don't think about access until it's too late." Over the next 18 months, the Disability Access Foundation launched in 15 cities. It wasn't about charity. It was about systematic restructuring of how businesses got built. Instead of waiting for violations to expose problems, the foundation worked to embed access from the foundation up. Marcus traveled to these cities. He sat in workshops where disabled entrepreneurs taught business owners how to think differently. He answered questions. He didn't have answers, but he had questions, and he'd learned that questions were often more useful than answers. The restaurant community in Portland shifted. What had started as a scandal became precedent. What had started as Marcus's violation became the baseline for how other businesses approached access. The Disability Access Initiative had audited over 200 businesses. 90% had made changes. The remaining 10% had closed or been sued. One evening, Marcus sat alone in the office and pulled up the original article that had exposed his violation. Irony or hypocrisy? Judge who enforces disability law accused of violating it. He read it again. Every word was true. He thought about what legacy meant. It didn't mean being remembered as good. It meant building structures that would outlast you, that would protect people even after you were gone, that would make it harder for the next person to do what he'd done. He would never recover his reputation. That wasn't the point. The point was that David Chun could eat at any restaurant in Portland without being turned away. The point was that Emily was running for office with a platform grounded in accessibility. The point was that a disabled entrepreneur in Eugene was opening a business because the foundation had given her access to capital that the traditional banking system had denied. The story didn't end in Marcus's redemption. It ended in systemic change, messy, incomplete, but real. It ended in disabled people building the future themselves, with people like Marcus responsible for removing obstacles instead of creating them. And in quiet moments, when no one was watching, Marcus understood that this was the only ending that mattered. Not his transformation, but the world transforming around the needs of the people he'd once excluded.